For the third week in a row, I'm about to spend some time with the music that features Dave Stewart on keyboards. For those of you that might be confused, as I was, this is not the Dave Stewart from the Eurythmics. Nor is it the Dave Stewart that plays bass trombone for the London Philharmonic. And it's also not the Dave Stewart that won the World Series MVP for the Blue Jays in 1993.
I could share this with each and every last one of them.
As you might have guessed, I've been doing some research on Dave Stewart, and I found out something that changed my timeline a bit. Going into this season, I had assumed that my first exposure to the Canterbury scene was when my friend Brooks introduced me to the music of gong about 20 years ago. Turns out I was off by about 15 years, because in college I discovered the Young Ones. Once in every lifetime! I love the Young Ones. I've watched the entire series multiple times. In the mid-90s, I started following the careers of most of the folks on the show, and this included getting myself a copy of Neil's Heavy Concept album by Nigel Planer.
I want to tell you about my groovy new album, right? It's called Neil's Heavy Concept album, and it's really beautiful.
So today, when I was going through the albums that constitute Dave Stewart's discography, I was delighted to see his name attached to Neil's Heavy Concept album as keyboardist and producer. Then for fun, I pulled out my copy of the album and took a look at the credits. I discovered that in the years since I first got the album, I'd become acquainted with more than just Dave Stewart. Jacko Jaksic, Gavin Harrison from King Crimson, Pip Pyle, Jimmy Hastings, and Rick Biddulph, all with National Health, Bryson Graham from Spooky Tooth, and Barbara Gaskin, one of the Northettes.
In the 80s, Dave Stewart's career took an interesting turn when he hooked up with singer Barbara Gaskin. They took a 60s pop classic and reimagined it in a proggy way. Check out their version of It's My Party. It might surprise you.
It's my party and I cry if I want to, cry if I want to.
And the songs on Neil's Heavy Concept album. Well, my memory is that I already knew Hole in My Shoe from Traffic.
Who's looking at me from a bubblegum tree?
I already knew The Gnome by Pink Floyd. And of course I knew God Save the Queen by the Sex Pistols. But what I just now found out is that Golf Girl is a Caravan cover from the very album that Sean referenced when we looked at the Rodders Club a couple weeks ago. And the version of Donovan's Hurdy-Gurdy Man is the version arranged by Steve Hillage. So yeah, I was wrong. My introduction to the Canterbury scene wasn't gong, as I originally thought. It was Neil's Heavy Concept album. And yeah, maybe this doesn't have a lot to do with National Health, but I thought it was interesting.
So does anyone know the background when it comes to the name National Health? You might be surprised to discover that it was actually named after Dave Stewart's glasses. According to the National Health Program in England, started in the 40s, you could get a free pair of glasses. And I guess it was kind of an inside joke with the band that Dave was wearing his National Health provided glasses. So now you know. Of Cues and Cures is another pinnacle Canterbury rock album, right up there with Rodders Club. As a matter of fact, I think it's a good companion to it. This is a slightly different ball of wax, though, because this band was primarily instrumental. Not completely. There's some wonderful vocals from Amanda Parsons on the debut album, and there's actually one vocal track on this album as well called Binoculars. For the most part, though, this was an instrumental group.
Serious music, this. On a taking themselves seriously scale, where 1 is not taking yourself seriously at all, like, say, the GTOs,
I'm a television baby.
and 10 is taking yourself way too seriously, like perhaps Alcatraz-era Yngwie Malmsteen, then what I am hearing on Of Cues and Cures ranks a bit higher than the other things I've heard from the Canterbury scene so far. I'd rank it slightly more serious than Particle Man.
Particle Man, is he a dot or is he a speck?
But less serious than Fagan and Becker deciding on which guitarist should play the solo on Peg. Careful, wise ass. That more serious demeanor is the biggest surprise for me after this first listen. Where the earlier Canterbury albums I've heard so far, like The Rotters Club or Angel's Egg, they feel to me like, let's see what we can get away with. Of Cues and Cures feels more to me like, okay, now let's see what we can do with it.
The late 70s was an interesting time for progressive rock. For a lot of progressive rockers, they were just doing what they've been doing all along. The fact that National Health's debut album came out right when punk was peaking didn't really matter much to them. After their first album was released, they toured extensively and went through a few lineup changes. Which brings us to the second album, Of Cues and Cures. Whereas the first album was mostly a writing partnership between Alan Gowan and Dave Stewart, by the second album, Alan had departed and it became mostly Dave's baby. So the majority of the album was written by him. There's also one song from each of the other guys in the band to round the record out, and they're all quite interesting as well.
The predominant vibes I'm getting from this album the first time around is more along the lines of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and maybe the John McLaughlin version of Tony Williams' Lifetime. Maybe even a bit of Rush at times.
Online I read that this is a bit like a blend of Gentle Giant, Frank Zappa, Caravan, Henry Cow, Atomic Rooster, and King Crimson. Whoever wrote that was on the money.
Except far more fusion than prog. The compositions are more technically difficult, but never not musical. So when a bar or two of odd meter appears in an otherwise straight piece, it always feels like it was necessary to fit the musical phrase, and not because they were trying to show themselves to be serious musicians. Taking a look at the tunes. The Bryden two-step, parentheses, for amphibians, close parentheses, brackets, part 1, close brackets. When the song started with a full minute of birdies and a single held chord, followed by another full minute of slowly meandering bass melody, I had concerns that we might be getting into some pretty ponderous space. But as soon as the song started in earnest, I completely forgot about that. That opening Tarkus meets Emergency section is damn impressive. And the breakdown to drums and fuzzed out Rhodes is one of the best things I've heard in a while. I love that sound.
A number of people feel the second album and the lineup that went with it was the stronger of the two. There was a certain conviction to songs like the Bryden two-step that wasn't quite as apparent on the debut. And it's been commonly said that more things happen in the 9 minutes of the Bryden two-step than many sidelong epics from progressive rock bands.
Quick question. Yes? There doesn't seem to be any place in the UK called Bryden. You think they might have meant Beryl Bryden? The British Bessie Smith, who also happened to play a mean washboard?
He's the guy that makes me get out of my dancing shoes.
As good a guess as any, I suppose. The Collapso. Clever title, clever use of steel drums to open the song. For the rest of it, I was mostly getting vibes of The Magician from Romantic Warrior, minus the 16th note histrionics at the beginning. The way that the melody kind of balances on top of the chords that feel like they're just barely being held together. Much harmonic tension, but in a good way. Like most of the tunes on Of Cues and Cures, Squarer for Maud turned out to be more involved than I suspected it might be at the start. The little 9/8 dirge at the beginning builds throughout the piece, even when you get abrupt time changes, like from 6/8 to 5/4 about 4.5 minutes in. It still feels like it's part of the same gradual buildup that's been happening the whole time. Then you get that numinescence reset about 6 minutes in. And from there, the connecting line becomes about increasing lyricism rather than increasing tension, culminating in big spectacular fusion solos with some thoroughly Zappa stops right at the end. The 6/4 riff in Dreams Wide Awake feels so very Tony Williams' Lifetime to me. The addition of flange to Dave Stewart's already evil organ tone actually made me laugh out loud. Love it. And then a song with lyrics. Binoculars. This is the closest thing I've heard on the album to the kind of lighter-hearted, yet musically satisfying stuff I heard on the Rotters Club. Only with more space. Space for improvisation and space for clever connecting interludes. Flaccaton. Weird British conical, maybe. And finally, the bookend of Bryden two-step parentheses for amphibians, close parentheses, brackets, part 2, close brackets. A revisit of the elements of the first track, but now we have a new context. Very grounding. Great way to end the album, I think. Yeah, it was good stuff.
For many, Of Cues and Cures is one of the last examples of Canterbury progressive rock and one of the greatest. By the late 70s, musical waters were changing, and in a way this album is sort of a goodbye to the 70s mindset of progressive rock. There's a lot of opportunities to stretch out, and I imagine live they did in many cases. There's some great improvisations on this record, but everything seems to have a purpose. It's definitely not some fusion wank fest by any means, although it does have fusion moments everywhere. Another interesting review I read said it's a good example of goofing off and writing complex music at the same time. I don't know if I'd buy that, but the whimsical quality of Canterbury music is definitely here as well. There's so many amazing harmonies and melodies here that just make it rise above the typical progressive rock of the day. There's an extra level of sophistication that you probably wouldn't find on a Yes record from the same year.
There's a disconnect somewhere. Must be. There has to be a disconnect in my life somewhere. Look, I've been a fan of fusion in one form or another since I used to ask to hear Blow by Blow in the car as a kid. In college, I took great delight in starting with the musicians on Bitches Brew and running down all the connections to discover all kinds of stuff. And not just the big ones like Mahavishnu, Return to Forever, and Weather Report, but some of the lesser known, deeper ones, right? Things like High Gear by Neil Larson, Alarms and Excursions by Bern Nix, Waves by Terry Ripdahl, even Velvet Darkness, the often overlooked first solo album by Alan Holdsworth. But the thing of it is, as far as fusion goes, Holdsworth is the closest I ever got to the Canterbury scene until now. For fusion, anyway. Honestly, having heard what I've heard these past few weeks, I don't understand why people don't mention Dave Stewart in the same breath as Chick Corea. Given how voraciously I dug into all the different pathways I could find for 70s fusion, I don't get how I never came across any of this music before now. It can't be entirely an America versus UK thing, because McLaughlin, Holdsworth, Bruford, Jack Bruce, Percy Jones, loved those guys. Loved them for years. I suspect it might be my dad's anti-prog bias. I know that several times over the years, I would try to get him to listen to something I was digging by a prog artist, and he'd just look at me and say, "Why don't they ever complete a thought?" Or, "Where's the goddamn solo already?" So maybe when I would come to him for ideas on fusion that I hadn't come across yet, I became an inheritor to his prog blind spot. But honestly, no more. I see no reason at all why people who love Romantic Warrior wouldn't also love Of Cues and Cures. I think it's brilliant.
If you loved Of Cues and Cures, be sure to check out the debut album as well. The debut album is every bit as interesting and compelling as Of Cues and Cures, and they're sort of a twofer. You really need to have both of them. The original lineup of National Health debuted in 1975. It was a mixture of musicians from groups like Hatfield in the North and Gilgamesh. As a matter of fact, the writing team of Dave Stewart and Alan Gowan really drove this original lineup. They're also joined by Amanda Parsons on vocals, which makes this album a little different than the follow-up. Also, if you like National Health, it'd probably be a good idea to check out what Dave Stewart did next. He played with Bill Bruford in the Bruford Band for 3 albums, starting with this one here, Feels Good to Me, the follow-up One of a Kind, and the final album, Gradually Going Tornado, which was considerably different as we discovered last week.
So yeah, Of Cues and Cures, Fish Rising, The Rotters Club, all going on my list of recommended fusion going forward. Honestly, kind of makes me even more excited for the rest of this series.